Charles Darwin admitted that evolution was a fraud, providing the evidence that the author published his book entitled On the Origin of Species, even though he had admitted that his theory of evolution was not true. A PowerPoint presentation of Publius Productions. This presentation was recorded on November the 14th, 2019. Permission is hereby granted to make copies. My name is Ralph Epperson, and I will be the one presenting this information. I want to explain that I am not a scientist. I have no degree in any scientific field of study. But I am like a high school student taking a course that teaches the evolutionary theory of origins. If you want me to believe it, you will need to provide me with some evidence that it is true. For the record, I've been reading on both sides of this evolution issue for over 45 years, and I am totally convinced that what I will be presenting is completely true. I have no staff assisting me, no researchers doing my research, no one advising me, and no one funding my work. I am totally responsible for what you will see and hear as I proceed through this material. Let me start by presenting a guest opinion of mine that the Tucson Citizen newspaper published on February the 8th, 1990 in their editorial section. This is the left-hand side of the article, and this is the right-hand side. So the headline, when put together, should read, "Frogs do not turn into princes, as evolutionists claim." I would like to quote the first two paragraphs. When I was a young boy, my mother would occasionally read me a bedtime story that she called a fairy tale. One of these told about how a frog turned into a prince. After she had finished with her soothing telling of the story, she assured me that this was just a story because it could not happen in real life. She did not want me to believe in fairy tales. It wasn't until I went to college that I learned how wrong my mother was. Fairy tales can come true. Frogs do turn into princes. PhDs all over the world know that. They call the process evolution. All it takes is time. It was in 1859 that Charles Darwin published his book entitled On the Origin of Species. So let me start the explanation of how Mr. Darwin admitted that his theory was wrong when he wrote it. First of all, I must define the word science. Webster's New World Dictionary defines it as knowledge derived from observation, study, and experiment. So I shall make my observations about this subject in keeping with the dictionary definition of the word. I would like to start by quoting Pierre-Paul Grasset, called the most eminent French zoologist, from page 4 of his book entitled Evolution of Living Organisms. The process of evolution is revealed only through fossil forms. A knowledge of paleontology, defined as a study of fossils, is a prerequisite. So I shall make my observations from the fossil record. Now I would like to explain the very essence of the Darwinian theory of evolution. As natural selection acts solely by accumulating slight successive favorable variations, evolution can produce no great or sudden modifications. It can act only by short and slow steps. Next, I would like to point out that Mr. Darwin accepted that his theory was difficult to accept. He wrote a letter to Thomas Huxley, one of his major supporters, on December the 2nd, 1869, just a few years after his book was published. This is what he wrote. I entirely agree with you that the difficulties of my notions are terrific. Darwin was having difficulty with his notions. For instance, Darwin admitted in a letter to Mr. George Bentham on May the 22nd, 1893, we can prove that no species has changed, which is the groundwork of the theory. That means that the foundation of his theory has no proof of it. So now that we have seen that Darwin himself had difficulties with his notions, I would like to quote two scientists who saw no difficulties with Darwin's notions. This is Dr. Carl Sagan, who was an astronomer from Cornell University. We will see that he did not have difficulties with Darwin's notions. He wrote this in his book entitled The Dragons of Eden in 1977. Evolution is a fact documented by the fossil record. So Dr. Sagan disagreed with Charles Darwin because Darwin admitted that there were difficulties with his notions. I would like next to quote Dr. Stephen Jay Gould, a Harvard paleontologist. He was a frequent guest on various major news programs explaining why he believed that evolution was in truth the correct position. This was his comment from his book. No scientist or thinking person doubts the basic fact that life evolves. So Dr. Gould also did not have any difficulties with Darwin's notions. So I will develop the information that both Dr. Sagan and Gould were not scientists or thinking persons because they both admitted that evolution was a fact while Darwin himself doubted that it was. Now is the time to start discovering the difficulties that Darwin had with his theory. The first of the 5 major problems that Darwin explained were to his theory was the fact that there is a sudden appearance of abundant life in the Cambrian layer. This is the geologic column showing the various layers of rock on the Earth as envisioned by the evolutionists. This is the simplest one that I have found. The evolutionists believe that the most recent and complex fossils will be on the top layer and the oldest and simplest ones will be at the bottom. But as I said, the Cambrian layer shown by the green arrow is cluttered with both recent and the oldest of fossils. And there are few, if any, fossils in the Precambrian layer on the bottom. But before we examine whether or not there is abundant life in the Cambrian layer, let me discuss some of the other problems with the entire geologic column. For instance, 77% of the surface areas of the Earth has 7 or more of the layers missing. 94% of the Earth's surface has 3 or more missing. And 99.6% has at least 1 missing layer. The entire geologic column exists only in the drawings of the geologists. Let me now discuss another difficulty one can have with Darwin's notions. This is the Paluxy River near Glen Rose, Texas, southwest of Dallas. The river suffered a huge flood in 1908 when the river rose 27 feet. And when people who lived near the river visited it after the flood, they found the top layers had eroded off and that the river level had dropped by many feet. The new layer of the Paluxy has been called the Glen Rose Limestone, designated as early Cretaceous. This layer has been thought to be approximately 120 million years old. and the visitors started noticing various dinosaur footprints in the stone. But not just individual prints, but many tracks as they moved forward, step by step, through the river. Here is a drawing, perhaps for the cover of a book, showing what type of dinosaurs made some of the tracks. But not only did the visitors find dinosaur footprints, they found human footprints as well, sometimes together. So these footprints drew researchers to the river to investigate the findings. But sometime later, after the footprints became public, the evolutionists went to the Paluxy River and looked at the footprints and noticed that some had, quote, changed color, end quote, which led them to believe they were not valid. So now the questions about the Paluxy River footprints have basically ended up as being abandoned. I would now like to refer to this book entitled Tracking Those Incredible Dinosaurs by Dr. John Morris. He received his PhD in geological engineering from the University of Oklahoma in 1980. Dr. Morris himself visited the Paluxy River site in 1975, along with two others, and commented on what they saw in the river. He included a black and white photograph of his human foot alongside a human foot in the stone on page 147 of his book. This version of the footprint can also be found on Google Images, but this time it is in color. You will notice that there is no evidence of a color change, so it was not one of those that reportedly did change. You can clearly see that it was made by a human because you can see the impressions of the 5 human toes. You can also see evidence of the mud being squeezed upward between some of the toes as the foot was pressed into the soft mud, and the different sizes of the 5 toes in keeping with a human footprint. Dr. Morris also included a black and white photograph on page 63 of a 7-foot-long carbonized stick found embedded in the Glen Rose limestone. I guess this broom was placed there to show you the scale of the stick. The stick was dated by the UCLA laboratory at 12,000 years old. I believe you can see the enormous problems that these 2 photographs offered by Dr. Morris pose to the evolutionists. The rock that these objects are in has been dated by the evolutionists at 120 million years of age. Man has been on the earth for approximately 1 million years, and the 7-foot stick embedded in the rock was dated at 12,000 years old. Yes, there are difficulties with Darwin's notions. Now let me quote Charles Darwin on his notions about the Cambrian layer. He wrote this: "The abrupt manner in which whole groups of species suddenly appear in the Cambrian layer has been urged by several paleontologists as a fatal objection to the belief in transmutations, meaning the slow change from species A to species B. If numerous species have really started into life all at once, the fact would be fatal." Notice that Darwin said this evidence would be fatal. Yes, he used the word fatal to my theory of descent with slow modification through natural selection. Darwin said that if there was abundant life in the lowest layer, it would be fatal to his theory. I seem to remember hearing that eating poisonous mushrooms would be fatal to the individual. In other words, the poisonous mushrooms would kill the person. If there was abundant life in the lowest layer, that would fact That fact would kill Darwin's theory. Darwin repeated the thought on page 313. Several of the most eminent geologists of his day are convinced that what we see in the Cambrian stratum is the dawn of life on this planet. So once again, Darwin admitted that if there was a sudden appearance of numerous species in the lowest layer of the geologic column, it would kill his theory, or it would be called the dawn of life. Now let me see if there's evidence that there is abundance of life exhibited in the Cambrian layer of the geologic column. This is the cover of the December 4th, 1995 edition of Time magazine. You can see that the cover is entitled Evolution's Big Bang. It is then subtitled, New Discoveries Show That Life as We Know It Began in an Amazing Biological Frenzy That Changed the Planet Almost Overnight. The inside portion of the magazine says this about the Cambrian layer. Then, in the early Cambrian, creatures with teeth and tentacles and claws and jaws with teeth materialized with the suddenness of apparitions, meaning ghosts, in a burst of creativity like nothing before or since. Nature appears to have sketched out the blueprints for virtually the whole of the animal kingdom. Now, I must admit that this is a magazine reporting on this Cambrian explosion, and one could argue that these writers might not be scientists. So let me now identify the thoughts on this subject by real scientists. Let me repeat this observation of Dr. Stephen Jay Gould, who said that no scientist or thinking person could doubt the basic fact of evolution, and this is what he wrote. I argue that an outstanding fact of the fossil record is the geologically sudden origin of new species. That means that Dr. Gould was not a scientist or a thinking person, because he supported evolution, but then stated that the sudden appearance of all life was, quote, fatal to evolution, end quote, which means he didn't support evolution. We shall see later how he chose to deal with this fact. Dr. Duane Gish has said this during his lecture in Tucson, that 95% of all animals on the surface of the earth are found in the Cambrian layer of rock, the oldest layer. Dr. Robert Carter reported this. Dr. Carter reported this in his book entitled Evolution's Achilles Heel. Descent with modification should progress from simple to complex. Instead, the greatest evolutionary innovations appear suddenly. Dr. Douglas Dewar, a British biologist, was quoted in a book entitled Bone Peddlers. A great fauna, meaning animal life, appears on the scene with startling abruptness at the beginning of the Cambrian period. We find nothing, which suggests slow evolution. Dr. Preston Cloud wrote these thoughts in the Geology magazine in 1973. In the Cambrian layer is found a multitude of highly complex creatures. Science magazine on May the 5th, 1978, placed every major animal group in the fossil record in the Cambrian rocks. Perhaps this is the time to discuss the horse series of fossils, because it is one of the earliest attempts to show that animals do evolve. This series starts with a 3- and 4-toed horse, and then passes through several 3-toed creatures and ends with a single-toed horse. Now let's talk about this. Nowhere in the world are the fossils of the horse series found in successive layers of the geologic column. When you examine one stratum in the geologic column, you will find both the three-toed and the one-toed animals together. Yet the evolutionists have taught that they are separated by millions of years. In South America, the one-toed horse is even found below the three-toed horse, meaning it evolved first, yet the horse series said it evolved after the one-toed horse. In fact, a fossil of a fully developed modern-day horse was found in the Cambrian layer of rock. But there is even more amazing circumstances in the horse series. The four-toed horse had 18 pairs of ribs. The next had 19 pairs. The third has 15 pairs. And finally, the modern horse has 18. The earliest horse was found in the same strata alongside two types of modern horses. This series of the evolution of the horse was on display of full-sized animals at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. I can vaguely remember seeing it when I visited the city as a young boy. But the display has reportedly been removed. In other words, the horse did not evolve. However, as I was preparing this video, someone sent me a picture of a horse that should be an intermediate in the horse column, and I've included it in this discussion. It shows that the horse had one toe, which means it must be placed in the column just before the last one. And here's that picture. It is obvious that it is an intermediate, because the only one ever, it is obvious that it is intermediate, perhaps the only one ever documented in the entire history of the evolutionary theory. But while we are here, it might be appropriate to talk about another quotation taken from The Origin of Species by Mr. Darwin. Here is that quote. If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed, which could also mean an animal species, which could not be formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. My theory would absolutely break down. I would like to submit the living animal known as a platypus as an example to Darwin's challenge. This animal was first seen in 1797, and it posed a real problem for those evolutionists who believed Darwin's theory. It has hair like a bear, a tail like a beaver, a bill like a duck. It lays eggs like a turtle. It has webbed feet like an otter. It burrows like a rabbit. It has claws like a lizard, and it feeds milk like a mammal. It looks like a combination of reptile, bird, fish, and furred animal. But in conclusion, there is absolutely no evidence that it could have evolved from anything. So the platypus, by itself, breaks down the entire theory of evolution, just as Darwin feared. So modern-day scientists of many fields of thought have all given testimony to the evidence of a Cambrian explosion, a Big Bang, where modern-day life suddenly appeared in the oldest layer of the geologic column, where by inference the layer should show simple life being fossilized. Let me repeat the thoughts of Mr. Darwin on this subject. The abrupt manner in which whole groups of species suddenly appear in the Cambrian layer has been urged by several paleontologists as a fatal objection to the belief in transmutations, meaning the slow change from species A to species B. If numerous species belonging to the same family have really started in life all at once, the fact would be fatal to the theory of descent with slow modification through natural selection. And once again, just as a reminder, consuming a poisonous mushroom becomes fatal to the organism. Now let me turn this discussion to the second fatal objection to Darwin's theory of evolution. The fact that there have been no intermediates found in any layer of the geologic column. Let me see if I can discuss what an intermediate fossil is. Darwin had hypothesized that early life would be single-celled, and that through a slow but steady progression it would evolve into another species. Here is a simple explanation of the process. The first species would be 100% A, and through a process known as evolution, it would slowly become species B. The first step would be a slow change to 99% A, 1% B, and then go through the changes of 98 and 2, 97 and 3, 96 and 4, 95 and 5. And then next, say approximately 50-50, and then 49 and 51. And here the species is now more species B than it is species A, 48, 52, 47, 53, and 46, 54. And then towards the end, 4% and 96%, 3 and 97, 2 and 98, 1 and 99, and then finally 0% A, 100% B. The species has changed to being 100% B through the slow process called evolution. Each of the steps from 99% A to 1% A would be an intermediate step in the process of evolution according to Charles Darwin. One could imagine that for every fossil of A and B being found, there should be an unknown number of intermediate fossils. It could be 100, 1,000, 10,000, or even 1,000,000, or even more. It is impossible to say, but there should be at least some intermediates found for every evolutionary step between any two species. Let me start with the second problem that Darwin wrote about: the lack of intermediates in the fossil record. His thoughts were, why then is not every geological formation and stratum, meaning of course the geologic column, full of such intermediate links? Geology, which is defined as the science that deals with the Earth's physical structure, assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic change. And this perhaps is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be argued against my theory. Darwin then offered his explanation as to why the fossil record does not reveal any of these intermediates. The explanation lies, I believe, in the extreme imperfection of the geologic column. In other words, the geologic column is imperfect, and someday better paleontologists will find the millions of intermediate fossils that will prove his theory. But in 1859, when he wrote his book, there were no intermediates, and that was the most obvious and gravest objection to my theory, end quote. This is the year 2019, 160 years after Darwin wrote his book. So let's examine the thoughts of today's paleontologists and other scientists to see if they have found millions and millions of intermediate fossils, because Darwin had hoped that they would. Anthropologist Edmund R. Leach told a 1981 meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, "Missing links in the sequence of fossil evidence were a worry to Darwin. He felt sure they would eventually turn up, but they are still missing and seem likely to remain so." David Rapp, the curator of geology at the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, which houses the world's largest fossil collection, wrote this: "Darwin was embarrassed by the fossil record because it didn't look the way he predicted. We are now 120 years after Darwin, and the fossil record has been greatly expanded. We now have 250,000 fossil species, and that, as of 1979 when he wrote his bulletin, the situation hasn't changed." That means that as of 1979, when he wrote the bulletin, there still weren't any intermediate fossils. I would like to return to Dr. Gould, the scientist who admitted that no scientist doubts the fact that life evolved. He wrote another book entitled The Panda's Thumb, published in 1980. Let's review his thoughts about Darwin's theory of evolution from the pages of this book. May I first remind you that Dr. Stephen Jay Gould was a professor until he passed away, a professor at Harvard, one of America's most prestigious universities. Here's what he wrote. The fossil record, when Darwin published his book, offered no support for gradual change. No support. We do not see slow evolutionary change in the fossil record. No change. The extreme rarity of the transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. Extreme rarity. Darwin was so wedded to gradualism that he wagered his entire theory on a denial of his literal record. Then he quoted Charles Darwin himself. "He who rejects these views on the nature of the geological record will rightly reject my whole theory." In summary, let me summarize what Dr. Gould wrote. Darwin knew that there were no intermediates for his theory, and that those who discover this truth would reject his whole theory. In other words, if there are no intermediates, the reader could rightly reject his whole theory. So Dr. Gould just said that Darwin knew that there were no intermediates in the fossil record, but he published his book anyway. But there was an extremely important thought that Dr. Gould wrote about that would be easy to just gloss over. Let's go back to the single sentence in Dr. Gould's own words. The extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology, which of course is the study of fossils. This is so important that I feel I must repeat it in a second review. The extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. I'm hoping that you can see the enormity of what Dr. Gould just said. He said that he and the other paleontologists are keeping a secret from the public. And that secret is that there are no intermediates. And that without intermediates there is no theory of evolution. This Harvard professor was admitting that not only the paleontologists but the whole entire scientific world are keeping a secret from the public. They keep teaching us that a theory is valid even though they know it is not. They are calling it a trade secret. This is a fraud of monumental proportions and is a disgrace to the entire field of scientific thought. A disgrace. Now let me return to Professor Gould's thoughts. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, not the evidence of fossils. Now this is a drawing of the evolutionary tree. You will notice that Dr. Gould was correct. The only animals are shown at the tips of the branches, and that is because there are no intermediate fossils. So now let's return to Dr. Gould. He said that in spite of the fact that there were no intermediates, he still believed that evolution was a fact. We will see how he handled this truth a little later. Colin Patterson, a senior paleontologist at the British Museum of Natural History, wrote a letter to a young student who asked him why he did not show any intermediate fossils in his book. This is how the doctor responded. I fully agree with your comment on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions, meaning the intermediates, in my book. If I knew of any, notice he said any means only one, fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. I will lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil, not one, for which one could make a watertight argument. How many intermediates are there? Not one. Not one. George Gaylor Simpson, perhaps the 20th century's foremost paleontologist, said this: the irregular absence of transitional fossils is an almost universal phenomenon, as has long been noted by paleontologists. Dr. David R. Kitts of the School of Geology at the University of Oklahoma, and he has commented on the absence of intermediate fossils. Evolution required intermediate forms between species, and paleontology does not provide them. You might remember that I quoted Dr. Stephen Jay Gould a little earlier in this presentation, where he said that evolution was a fact. I can only presume that Dr. Gould read Darwin's book, in which Darwin said that there were no intermediates, yet he said that evolution was a fact. There is no evolutionary theory without intermediates. I do not understand how anyone could read Darwin's book without learning that he knew that there were no intermediates. I'll repeat it again. There is no evolutionary theory without intermediates. And I want to point out that Mr. Darwin himself said the number of intermediates should be great. This is what he said on page 293 of his book. The number of the intermediate links between all living and extinct species must have been inconceivably great. But as we have seen, the number of intermediates is not, quote, great, unquote. There are none. After we read all of these admissions from Dr. Darwin himself that his theory was wrong, I will guess that there is not one teacher or professor anywhere in the world who will ask his students to read Darwin's book entitled The Origin of Species. They do not want them to read that Darwin admitted that his theory was a fraud. Apparently, Dr. Gould realized that Darwin's theory was simply not true, so he had to come up with a competing theory. So he and Dr. Niles Eldredge of Columbia University in New York City pooled their thoughts and came up with a new theory of evolution. They called it punctuated equilibrium. Punctuated equilibrium. Dr. Gould wrote, "We argued that two outstanding facts of the fossil record, geological sudden origin, meaning evolution's Big Bang, and failure to change thereafter, meaning there were no intermediate fossils, reflect the predictions of the new evolutionary theory. It states that organisms are in a stable condition until a major change causes evolutionary pressure, which results in the sudden appearance of new species. Then there is stability once again until a new species suddenly appears. So punctuated equilibrium totally replaces Darwin's theory. So these two scientists have developed the new theory of evolution. Species A exists for a long period, and then suddenly species B appears fully developed. And then species C appears fully developed, which leads to species D suddenly appearing fully developed, all without intermediate steps. By the way, this new evolutionary theory tends to substantiate the creationist theory of species, that all life was created at the same time. Now I would like to discuss the third problem with Darwin's theory, the need for billions and billions of years for evolution to take place. Let me now briefly deal with the age of the universe and of the earth. The evolutionists tell us that the latest estimate of the age of the universe is 14 billion years. The latest estimate of the age of the earth is 5 billion years. And it is estimated that man appeared on the earth about 1 million years ago. You see, evolution needs these long ages for it to have worked. This is the top half of a poor quality copy of an article that appeared in the April 10, 1982 Tucson, Arizona Citizen newspaper by the Washington Post News Service. As you can see, the headline reads, "Sun Losing Energy, Data Show." It spoke about a U.S. satellite put into Earth orbit 2 years ago, indicating an almost continuous decline in the sun's radiant energy. This is the second part of the same article from another page, and it reported that Dr. John Eddy of the High Altitude Observatory in Boulder, Colorado, had discovered that the sun may have been shrinking by as much as 0.1% every 100 years for the last 4 centuries. And he also said, "There's no reason to believe that the solar constant is constant." So Dr. Eddy was saying that the evolutionists are wrong because they apparently believe that the energy of the sun has been constant for billions and billions of years. This is an article that appeared in the Tucson, Arizona Daily Star newspaper of November the 21st, 1986, about 4 years later. It confirmed that the dimming of the sun had continued and that the article named the satellite that has been measuring the size of the sun as the Solar Maximum Mission Satellite. And the headline reads, Sun has dimmed by 0.1% since 1980, satellite observation shows. This evidence was confirmed by a report in the book entitled Atlas of the Solar System by Patrick Moore and Gary Hunt, published in 1983. In 1979, evidence was put forward indicating that the sun was shrinking. From an analysis of solar diameter measurements made at the Royal Observatory, Greenwich, England, over a period of about 120 years from 1836 to 1954. It was suggested that the diameter was decreasing by about 0.1% per century. If this figure is correct and represented a uniform rate of decrease, then the sun would have been twice its present size about 100,000 years ago. Dr. Eddy has found 400-year-old eclipse observations that are consistent with such shrinkage. Let me see if I can explain just how they can use eclipses to measure the size of the sun. I have made these diagrams to illustrate how it works, and they are exaggerated to hopefully show you the way scientists have used them to measure the shrinkage. We shall go back into the past and show an eclipse of the sun by the moon. You can see that the sun is quite larger than the moon is in this eclipse. In another eclipse sometime later, you will notice that the sun is smaller. This can be measured by scientists as a way of determining that the sun is shrinking. There's another way to confirm that the shrinkage of the sun has only been occurring for a short period of time. It involves the water on the surface of the planet. Water has a very narrow range between freezing and boiling. The distance between the freezing point and the boiling point for a given planet is called the water band. A planet would have to be 95% of the Earth's distance from the sun to allow water to exist in the liquid state. Any distance less than this would be so hot that the water would be in the gaseous state. If a planet was 1.5 times as far from the sun as the Earth, all of its water would be in the form of ice. Dr. Andrew Snelling wrote this: if we were to suppose that the rate of shrinkage of the sun has been constant throughout history, then only 20 million years ago the surface of the sun would be touching the Earth. Now, of course, the sun has been measured as being approximately 93 million miles away from the Earth. So I am not acting as an alarmist. I am sure that there are still great amounts of time before the sun burns up all of its fuel. This drawing is not drawn to scale, but it is a drawing of the size of the sun and then the first three planets of our universe: Mercury, Venus, and the Earth. 100,000 years ago, the sun would be twice its size. This is what it might look like compared to the Earth just 100,000 years ago. How hot would it be? Life on the planet could not survive. It would be obviously too hot. Now let me extend the sun backwards to the size it would be 100 million years ago. The sun would have engulfed the earth. There would be no earth. The earth would have been swallowed up, engulfed by the sun. So our solar system, our sun, cannot be billions of years old. There would be no earth just 100 million years ago. And the evolutionists say that the universe is 14 billion years old. Let me put those two numbers side by side. First, 100 billion years, and then 14 billion years. Let me provide you with other scientific examples that prove that the Earth is young. And this discusses the magnetic field of the Earth. This is Dr. Thomas Barnes, professor of physics at the University of Texas, El Paso. He pointed out that the magnetic field of the Earth has been measured for 135 years and has shown that it has been decaying with a half-life of 1,400 years. That would mean that the magnetic field was twice as strong 1,400 years ago as it is now. It would be 4 times as strong 2,800 years ago, and only 7,000 years ago it must have been 32 times as strong. Thus, 10,000 years ago, the Earth would have had a magnetic field as strong as that of a magnetic star. This, he said, is highly improbable, to say the least. Thus, 10,000 years seems to be an outside limit for the age of the Earth. I've got 12,000 there, but it's really 10. Let me now discuss the subject of oil seepage. It has been estimated that the amount of oil that seeps into the oceans is 5 million tons per year. It is also estimated that the total amount of offshore oil is 100 billion tons, which means that the total amount of oil would have been lost to the oceans 2,500 times if oil is only estimated to be 50 million years old. And it would take only 20,000 years to deplete the entire quantity of offshore oil. Let's discuss helium decay. As plant and animal life dies and then decays, a certain amount of helium is released into the atmosphere. Estimating by the rate of addition of helium to the atmosphere from radioactive decay, the age of the Earth appears to be about 10,000 years old, even allowing for moderate helium escape to the space above the atmosphere. Let's discuss population growth. The evolutionists generally theorize that man evolved about 1 million years ago. These early humans have certainly multiplied to the point where there are now about 7 billion people on the Earth. An average population growth of 0.5% a year would create the present population in just 4,000 years. By the way, this is only 1/4 of the present rate of about 2% a year. Let's discuss the transport of sediment. The present rate of transport of sediment by rivers could fill the oceans 19 times in 3.5 billion years. And the continents would be eroded to sea level in a mere 10.2 million years. Now these examples are only a few of the 68 decay rates documented in this book by Doctors Henry Morse and Gary E. Parker. In addition, the following is a partial list of books published by scientists who have documented the fact that the Earth is very young and not very old as is required by the theory of evolution. Age of the Cosmos. Scientific creationism. It's a young Earth after all. What is creation, scientists, and the young Earth? Let me say this. If only one of the 68 decay rates is true, it would prove by itself that the universe is not old, it is young. And that single decay rate would prove by itself to be fatal to the evolutionary theory. Only one. I have quoted a variety of scientists, some of whom are the leaders in their field. They have all proclaimed that Darwin was wrong. As I have said, there are no intermediate fossils, and there should be many, probably in the millions or who knows how many. And these two scientists knew that evolution was not true, and they and others continued to teach it in the high schools and the universities and graduate schools all over America. And I want to know why. Why? Why are they still teaching this fraud? I want to go on record as urging the true scientific community to join together and expose the truth about what I have only briefly covered. It is time to close the curtain on evolution. Now, the last area of science that I want to cover is this one. What is the purpose of evolution? Why did Darwin publish his book? This is Julian Huxley, a British evolutionary biologist. He was born in 1887 and died in 1975. He was a vocal defender of the Darwinian theory of evolution and frequently wrote about it. I decided that I should find out as much as I could about Mr. Huxley, so I went into my personal library and searched through the 50 or so books that I've read on the evolutionary issue. I then searched the internet through sites that featured the quotes of famous people and searched the name of Julian Huxley. And I went through these and found many quotes of his that address the theory of evolution. So these are Mr. Huxley's words that speak to the reason that evolution is still being taught. I want you to know just what this, quote, scientist, unquote, believes. Julian Huxley wrote, "Evolution is the most powerful idea that has ever arisen on the earth." Dr. Henry Morse confirmed Huxley's thoughts. He said this, "Darwinism removed the whole idea of God as the creator of organisms from the sphere of rational discussion. He pointed out that no supernatural designer was needed, since natural selection could account for any known form of life. There was no room for a supernatural agency in its evolution." William R. Fix, in his book entitled The Bone Pillars, agreed. Julian Huxley met in Chicago in 1959 to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the book's publication. He declared that Darwin's real achievement was to remove the whole idea of God as the creator of organism from the sphere of rational discussion. Julian Huxley also wrote this, "Modern science must rule out special creation or divine guidance. And this, it will soon be impossible for an intelligence, agent, educated man or woman to believe in a God. And this, the God hypothesis, is no longer of any value. And this, in the evolutionary pattern of thought, there is no longer need or room for the supernatural. And Mr. Huxley wrote this: man is not under the control or guidance of any supernatural being or beings, but has to rely on himself and his own powers. Several years ago, I went to a street fair in Tucson, Arizona, and I stopped at the booth of the Tucson Atheist Society. I asked the man at the booth this question: what book can I read that discusses the morality of an atheist? And he answered that there is no such book. I then asked him how each atheist determines what is right or wrong. And he answered, each person is free to determine his own morality. Stephen Jay Gould also spoke about how an evolutionist determines right or wrong. If evolution, he said, if nature is non-moral, or evolution, meaning that it takes is non-moral, meaning that it takes no position about morality, then evolution cannot teach any ethical theory at all. Mr. Huxley agreed. Today, the God hypothesis is becoming a moral burden to our thought. He went on, I suppose the reason we leaped at the origin of species was because the idea of God interfered with our sexual mores. In other words, we wished to be libertine, defined as one free from self-restraint. Evolution gave us the ability to seek sexual pleasure whenever and with whomever we wished. This means, saying it as simply as I can, we wanted to be free to rape any female we wanted, free from prosecution by any civil government. And as they say, the proof is in the pudding. The 2016 National Crime Victimization Survey, abbreviated the NCVS, which measures sexual assaults and rapes that may not have been reported to the police, found that there were 431,840 incidents of rape or sexual assault in 2015. And if you wish to verify this, this is the source from Wikipedia. I am saying that many in America see the fact that this nation's civilization is slowly deteriorating. And I say the reason is, in the main, the false theory of evolution. The false theory of evolution. And I would dare say that Julian Huxley was right. He said that the supernatural is being swept out of the universe, and it is happening right in front of our very eyes, America. And the reason is because of evolution. Let me now show you two scientists who have discovered a real truth. There is a God, and he cannot be driven out of the universe. And this is how we know that this is true. This is a poor quality photocopy of an article that appeared in the August 14th, 1981 edition of the London Daily Express newspaper, and as you can see, the headline reads, "There must be a God." Please notice that they have underlined the word must. The two scientists in the picture are Dr. Chandra Wickramasinghe and Sir Dr. Fred Hoyle. Dr. Wickramasinghe is a professor of astronomy at the Cardiff College in Wales, and Dr. Hoyle is the director of the Institute of Astronomy at Cambridge University. Each of these scientists, independently of each other, computed the number of chances necessary for even the simplest life imaginable to have evolved by chance. To be 1 chance in 10 to the 40,000th power. That is roughly comparable to the probability of rolling double sixes, meaning a total of 50,000 times in a row. Let me see if I can put that into perspective. Let's say that you roll 10 times in a row, which by itself would be extremely difficult, because there are 11 different ways that the 2 dice can land. And the 11th time you roll a 6, you would have to start over again. That can show you just how difficult it would be to roll this 50,000 times in a row. And to show you just how huge that 50,000 number is, in another way, Dr. Carl Sagan wrote an article on page 9 of Parade Magazine's edition of May the 31st, 1987 that said, "The number of grains in all of the beaches of the earth is 10 to the 30th power, meaning 10 followed by 30 zeros." Now let me put these two figures together on one page to show you just how enormous the odds are for the number of grains in all of the beaches against the chance of life originating by chance. 10 to the 30th power, and life by chance to the 40,000th power. In other words, the universe originating by chance has no chance. No chance. Let me now offer you this quotation from Dr. Wickramasinghe. "I am 100% certain that life could not have started spontaneously. The favorable property of physics on which life depends are in every respect deliberate. And I say, the human life screams at the observer. The universe is too complex to have been assembled by chance. It had to be the result of a conscious design of a designer. There must be a God." These two scientists proved it. I think it would be appropriate at this point for me to summarize the entire discussion with this quotation from Dr. Richard Dawkins, a biologist at Oxford University in England. Oxford, of course, is another of these prestigious universities. "It is absolutely safe to say that if you meet somebody who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, or insane. The evidence against evolution includes the very words of its founder, Charles Darwin, and the verdict reached is evolution is totally bogus." Mr. Huxley spoke the truth when he challenged us with these words: "Sooner or later, false thinking brings wrong conduct. False thinking brings wrong conduct." Now I must offer a possible reason for the rash of students shooting their fellow students. Is evolution a cause? Evolution does not teach moral values. In fact, it states that there are no moral values. It teaches the student that since there are no moral absolutes, If he decides to murder his fellow students, he is free to murder. Julian Huxley was telling the truth in this quotation. Sooner or later, false thinking brings wrong conduct. And evolutionists are teaching America's children. As I said before, it is time to bring down the curtain on the theory of evolution.